The signature on the divorce papers was still wet when my husband, Mark, told me that our house, the one I had poured my entire inheritance into, was no longer legally mine. He didn't even look me in the eye as he pushed the file across the mahogany table, his voice as cold and sterile as a medical report. I stood there, stunned into silence, while my mother-in-law, Elena, sat in the corner of our dining room, sipping chamomile tea with a satisfied, predatory smile that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a divorce. It was a systematic erasure of my existence from a life I had spent 7 years painstakingly building from scratch. 3 months ago, my world had been a masterpiece of carefully curated stability. I remember the scent of fresh lavender laundry detergent that always seemed to cling to the curtains in our living room and the way the morning light hit the kitchen island, the very island I had paid for with the money my grandmother left me. My life with Mark was a rhythm of quiet morning coffees, his predictable commute, and our shared dreams of renovating the attic into an art studio. He was a man of routines. He liked his toast lightly browned, his ties color-coded, and his weekends spent reviewing architectural plans for his burgeoning career. He had been promoted to senior project manager at a prestigious firm, a milestone we had celebrated with champagne on the balcony, toast to a future that felt as solid as the stone walls of our home. Elena, Mark's mother, had been a fixture in our lives, though she always felt like a portrait hanging slightly crooked on the wall. She was the woman who would show up unannounced, bringing her own brand of bitter tea, critiquing the way I folded the linens, or the choice of paint in the nursery we hadn't even started to fill yet. "A woman's place is to be the anchor, dear," she would say, her voice dripping with a performative sweetness that never quite reached her sharp, observant eyes. I tolerated her because she was his mother, and because Mark would always squeeze my hand and whisper, "Just bear with her, she's lonely," which felt like a reasonable price to pay for the peace in our home. I didn't realize then that the lavender scent was just masking the smell of decay. I didn't see that every time I left the house for an errand, Elena would subtly reposition things, moving documents from the home office to her handbag or hovering near the landline in the hallway. I was too busy planning our 10th anniversary trip to the coast, oblivious to the fact that Mark's late-night meetings were becoming more frequent and his phone was increasingly kept face down on every surface. The house, our sanctuary, was slowly transforming into a stage set for a play I wasn't cast in. I thought we were a team building an empire, but in the shadows, they were filing down the foundations. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday. I had come home early from a gallery opening to find Mark and Elena huddled over a stack of blueprints that certainly didn't belong to any project he was working on. When I walked in, the silence was so heavy it felt pressurized. Mark quickly flipped a heavy folder over, his face flushing a mottled, unnatural red. "It's just private consultancy work, babe. So you know how the firm gets," he mumbled, not meeting my gaze as he scrambled to clear the table. Elena didn't even bother to hide her annoyance. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and leveled a look at me that felt like an eviction notice. "Men don't like to be watched while they're working, darling. Perhaps you should find something to do in the garden." I brushed it off as stress. I blamed his long hours, the pressure of the promotion, and his mother's suffocating presence. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid, that the sudden change in his demeanor, the way he stopped kissing me goodbye, the way he flinched when I touched his shoulder, was simply the toll of his new responsibilities. I even bought him a high-end watch as a congratulations gift, a piece of jewelry that he accepted with a strained, almost guilty smile before locking it away in a safe I didn't have the combination to. I wanted to believe in the man I married, the man who had promised to love me through every season of life. I didn't know that season had already ended. I was just the last one standing in the winter frost, waiting for a spring that would never come. Little things began to accumulate, a mounting pile of evidence I was too emotionally blinded to interpret correctly. I found a receipt for a luxury hotel stay in the city, dated for a night Mark claimed he was working late at the office. I found a series of emails on our shared computer, though they were encrypted and bore names I didn't recognize. names that sounded more like shell corporations than architectural clients. My intuition, that quiet, humming alarm bell deep in my gut, had been ringing for weeks, but I kept reaching out and hitting the snooze button. I wanted the fairy tale to hold, even as the pages were being torn out by the very hands I trusted most. I was a passenger in a car, driven by someone who had already decided to steer us off a cliff, and I was still worried about the dust on the dashboard. The atmosphere in the house shifted from one of quiet domesticity to a state of perpetual, low-frequency warfare. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, suffocating erosion of my reality. I began to notice how Mark would leave his phone in the kitchen when he showered, but the moment I walked into the room, he'd materialize as if he'd been waiting for the sound of my footsteps. Elena stopped pretending to like the flowers I planted, instead spending hours sitting on our patio, watching the property line with a telescope-like intensity. She wasn't gardening, she was surveying. Whenever I tried to talk to Mark about our future, about the renovations or the trip, he would look through me, his eyes glazing over as if he were rehearsing a script he didn't particularly want to perform. Then came the calls. I started waking up at 3 a.m. to the sound of hushed, frantic whispering coming from the study. Each time I crept down the hallway, the house would go deathly silent, the air still thick with the residual tension of a conversation cut short. "Who were you talking to?" I asked one morning, my hand trembling as I poured coffee. Mark didn't even look up from his screen. Telemarketers, for heaven's sake. Or the site foreman. Everything is under a deadline and you're hovering, which isn't helping. He sounded so annoyed, so burdened by my presence, that I felt an immediate, stinging wave of shame for daring to ask. The turning point arrived on a rainy Thursday when a courier dropped off a heavy, legal-sized envelope at the front door. Mark was at the gym, and Elena had gone out for her weekly bridge club session. The envelope was addressed to me, but the return address was a law firm I didn't recognize. My hands shook so violently as I broke the seal that I nearly tore the paper. Inside were not just bank statements, but a set of property deeds. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a dull, rhythmic thud that filled my ears, drowning out the sound of the rain against the glass. I spread the documents across the kitchen island, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The first page was a deed of trust, dated just 2 weeks prior. It showed that our house, the home I had purchased entirely with my inheritance, had been transferred into a limited liability company, with Elena listed as the sole proprietor. My vision blurred. I flipped to the next page and felt the floor tilt beneath me. There was my signature, or what looked exactly like it, authorizing the transfer. The nausea hit me in a wave, cold and sharp. I leaned over the sink, my knuckles white as I gripped the granite, watching the world through a sickening haze of disbelief. I scrambled to the study, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't care about privacy anymore. I needed the truth. I pried open the top drawer of Mark's desk, the one he always kept locked, using a letter opener I'd found in the kitchen. Inside wasn't just the expected stationery, but a ledger. It was thick, leather-bound, and filled with dates, dollar amounts, and names I didn't know. The final entry was a bank draft for a staggering sum, siphoned from our joint savings account, moved into an offshore holding account that belonged to an entity called the EV Trust. The pieces clicked into place with a terrifying, agonizing finality. The promotion, the late nights, the nervous glances. It was all a theater production designed to strip me of every asset I owned. I collapsed into his chair, the room spinning, the air in the house turning icy. My phone buzzed on the desk, a notification for a bank alert. Account balance, $14.22. The reality didn't hit me all at once. It felt like 1,000 tiny shards of glass piercing my skin. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had systematically dismantled my identity, turning me into a squatter in my own life. I sat in the dark of his study, the smell of his cologne lingering on the chair, and for the first time, I felt the cold, hard spark of something that wasn't fear. It was something much sharper. It was the realization that I was no longer fighting for my marriage. I was fighting for my survival. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness of the study, the leather chair feeling like a cold slab beneath me, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window pane in the wind sounded like a taunt. When the front door finally clicked open, the sound was deafening. I heard Mark's voice, low and murmuring, followed by the sharp, impatient click of Elena's heels on the hardwood. They were arguing. "It's done, Mark. Stop pacing like a nervous schoolboy." Elena's voice was crisp, cutting through the silence of the house like a razor. "She's not going to check the tax portal for months, and by then the LLC will have finalized the zoning. She'll have no choice but to sign the buyout when we present the eviction notice. It's for the best." "I just don't like the look on her face lately, Mom," Mark replied, his voice strained, stripped of that professional mask he wore for the outside world. "She's been quiet, too quiet. What if she's figured out the signature discrepancy? Then she's a thief who tried to forge a transfer to hide assets from you during a hypothetical divorce." Elena scoffed, her laugh hollow and cruel. "Don't be weak. You're a senior project manager now. You don't get there by coddling women who think their father's money entitles them to command the house." I stood up. My movement was slow, deliberate. I walked to the door, my heart beating with a terrifying, rhythmic clarity. When I pushed it open, the light from the hallway caught them in a tableau of calculated betrayal. Mark was leaning against the kitchen island, his tie undone, holding a glass of scotch. Elena was standing in front of him, clutching her purse like a weapon. They froze. "The house is already under the trust, isn't it?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. It was thin, metallic, and utterly foreign to my own ears. Mark's glass hit the granite with a dull thud, splashing amber liquid across the white surface. He didn't speak. His eyes darted to his mother, a silent, pathetic plea for help that made my stomach turn. Elena, however, recovered instantly. She straightened her spine, her expression shifting into one of practiced, condescending pity. "Oh, darling," she cooed, taking a step toward me. "You've been snooping. That's very unbecoming. I suppose the stress of the marital issues has finally cracked your composure." "Marital issues?" I echoed, stepping into the light. I held up the ledger I had taken from the desk. Mark's face went ash gray, the color draining from his skin as if someone had pulled a plug in his veins. "Is that what we're calling grand larceny these days, Elena? Or perhaps we should call it what it is, a conspiracy to defraud. I have the bank records, the transfer dates, and this beautiful, detailed list of every account you've bled dry." Mark finally found his voice, though it was a desperate, stuttering mess. "Listen, honey, it's not what you think. It was an investment strategy. I was trying to protect our assets from the firm's liability in case the project went south. I was going to tell you. You were going to tell me after you evicted me." I cut him off, my voice rising in a controlled, icy crescendo. "You used my inheritance to leverage your promotion. You used your mother to forge my identity. You didn't protect me, Mark. You gutted me." Elena stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "You were never really part of this, you know. You were just a temporary bridge to the capital Mark needed to launch his career. Look at you. You're a fragile little bird who couldn't even manage a household without asking permission. Did you really think you were his partner? You were an obstacle." The second twist hit me then, not just the betrayal, but the cold, hard realization that they had been planning this since the day we got married. I noticed, for the first time, a photo tucked into the edge of the ledger. It was a picture of Mark and a woman I'd never seen, dated 3 months before our wedding. On the back, in Elena's sharp, cramped handwriting, the backup plan if the heiress fails to produce. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, chilling sensation wash over me, a feeling of total detachment. I looked at Mark, my husband, my anchor, and saw only a coward cowering behind his mother's skirts. "You think this is a business deal," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "But you forgot one thing, Mark. My father was a trial attorney, and he taught me that if you're going to burn down the house, you'd better make sure you're not still standing inside it." I turned on my heel and walked toward the front door. "Where do you think you're going?" Elena shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "You have nothing. You're legally bound to the terms of the trust." I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. "I'm going to make a phone call, and by the time you wake up tomorrow, you're going to realize that the owner of this house isn't you, Elena. And it certainly isn't Mark. It's the bank, the one that's about to foreclose because of the fraudulent transfer." I slammed the door behind me, leaving them in the silence of the house they had tried so hard to steal, unaware that I had just lit the match. The cool night air hit my skin like a physical slap, grounding me. As I walked to the edge of the property, the world seemed to slow down, everything turning into a series of jagged, high-stakes decisions. My phone was in my hand, glowing in the dark, and I didn't hesitate. I dialed my father's old associate, Mr. Thorne, a man who had spent 40 years specializing in corporate fraud and who, fortunately, still owed my father a debt of honor. "Clarissa." His voice was gravelly, thick with sleep but instantly alert. "It's nearly midnight. Is everything all right?" "Everything is far from all right, Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice steady, stripped of all the softness I had allowed myself for 7 years. "I need you to look into a shell company called the EV Trust, and I need you to cross-reference my digital signature on a property transfer deed dated 2 weeks ago. I think you'll find that both the company and the signature are, let's say, structurally unsound." There was a long silence on the other end, followed by the sharp intake of breath. "Clarissa, if what I suspect is true, this isn't just civil litigation. This is federal territory." "Then let's make it federal," I whispered. I didn't go back into the house. I spent the night in my car, parked at a 24-hour diner 3 miles away, watching the sunrise paint the sky in bruises of purple and gray. By 8 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Thorne. "The EV Trust isn't just a shell, Clarissa. It's registered under Elena Vance's maiden name. And the transfer deed? The notary stamp is a forgery from a defunct firm in a neighboring state. You've been robbed, but they've been sloppy. Very, very sloppy." When I returned to the house, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. Mark was standing in the driveway looking frantic. His car was packed with suitcases. When he saw me, he looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Elena was standing in the doorway, her phone pressed to her ear, her face a pale shade of panic. "Clarissa!" Mark shouted, jogging toward me. "Where the hell were you? Mom has been calling the police to report. Well, she was worried sick." I stepped out of my car, moving with a predatory grace I didn't know I possessed. I wasn't the fragile bird anymore. "Save it, Mark. We're past the part where you pretend to be the concerned husband." Elena marched out, her voice shrill. "You stupid girl, you have no standing here. We've already contacted the realtor. This house is being liquidated as of this morning to cover the debt you owe the trust. You are legally a squatter on private property." I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a court-ordered injunction Thorne had managed to push through on an emergency basis. I handed it to her. Her eyes scanned the text, and I watched with immense satisfaction as her face drained of all its artificial color. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "It's a freeze on all assets associated with the EV Trust," I said, my voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. "Including your personal accounts, Elena. Turns out when you move stolen funds into a shell company, you create a paper trail that even a novice investigator can follow. And as for the property, since the transfer was based on a forged document, the house is currently under a federal lien. You can't sell it, you can't transfer it, and you certainly can't live in it." Mark looked at the paper, then back at me, his mouth agape. The third twist landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. "And there's one more thing," I continued, glancing at the stack of suitcases in his car. "I found the other file, Mark, the one you tried to hide behind the ledger. You weren't just defrauding me to build a business. You were paying off a blackmailer, a woman named Sarah, who has proof of your involvement in the embezzlement at your previous firm. The promotion was a lie. You were being promoted out of a scandal, not into a career." Mark's knees buckled. He grabbed the side of his car for support, the bravado completely vanishing from his face. "How did you—" "You left your tablet logged in, Mark. You were always so concerned with your image that you forgot that every secret leaves a digital shadow," I said, feeling a surge of cold, electric power. Elena lunged at me, her hand raised, but I caught her wrist with a strength that surprised us both. I leaned in close, my breath hitting her cheek. "If you touch me, that's assault. If you stay on this property, that's trespassing. And if you try to leave the state, that's flight from an active federal investigation. I suggest you start calling a lawyer because your backup plan is currently being served a subpoena by a federal marshal at your office, Mark." I turned away from them, leaving them stranded in the driveway of the house they had tried to steal, surrounded by the remnants of their own greed. I walked to the front door, pulled the key from my bag, and unlocked it. The house was quiet, but for the first time in years, it felt like it belonged to me. The scent of lavender had finally faded, replaced by the crisp, clean air of a new beginning. I walked inside, locked the door, and waited for the police to arrive. The transformation was complete. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the architect of their downfall. The final hour in that house felt like a slow-motion unraveling of a fever dream. When the police sirens finally cut through the morning stillness, I was sitting in the living room, a cup of lukewarm tea in my hands. The sight of Mark, my husband of 7 years, handcuffed and stumbling over his own apologies as he was led to the cruiser, was not the triumph I had expected. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was profoundly, almost boringly quiet. Elena stood by the police vehicle, her face a mask of shattered pride, her sharp, judgmental eyes now wide with a frantic, animalistic fear as she realized the depth of the hole she had dug for herself. My transformation was not a sudden explosion of rage, but a chilling internal crystallization. I watched them go, and I felt nothing but a cool, detached relief. There was no more heart racing, no more trembling. I had become a woman who understood the language of consequences. The legal aftermath was a whirlwind of depositions and forensic audits. Thorne was as relentless as a shark in the water. We uncovered the depth of their rot, the offshore accounts, the forged notarized stamps, the systemic blackmail Mark had been under for years. By the end of the second month, the EV trust had been liquidated, and the court had returned the house and the frozen assets to me, minus the debts Mark had incurred in his desperate, failing efforts to stay afloat. The trial itself was brief. Elena was found guilty of conspiracy and fraud, her social standing evaporating the moment the headlines hit the morning papers. She became a cautionary tale in the high society circles she'd once spent so much time curating. Mark received a harsher sentence, his criminal past at his previous firm catching up to him the moment his current fraud was exposed. He lost his license, his reputation, and his freedom, all in the span of one cold autumn afternoon. I remember the last time I saw him through the thick glass of the visiting room. He looked small, gray, and utterly hollow. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic, rehearsed apology, but I simply turned and walked away. There was no closure to be found in his words, only in my own silence. 6 months later, the house looked different. I had stripped the place of every piece of furniture Elena had touched, every shade of paint she had critiqued. I painted the walls a soft, expansive white that caught the morning light in a way that felt like a breath of fresh air. I spent my days in the attic, The space Mark and I had once talked about renovating as a shared studio. Now, it was my sanctuary. I had turned it into a workspace for my own art, a place where I didn't need permission to exist, where every stroke of the brush was a reclamation of my own soul. I stood on the porch one crisp, late October morning, watching the leaves drift across the lawn. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, not the sterile, chemical lavender of my past. My life was no longer a stage for someone else's drama, nor was it a fragile artifact to be guarded from those who would steal it. I was finally alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was whole. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs with a sharpness that felt like life itself. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the key to the front door, and looked at it. Not as a key to a prison, but as a key to an island. My bank accounts were secure, my name was on every deed, and my future was a blank canvas that I alone had the right to paint. I didn't look back at the driveway where the police cruisers had once sat. I turned, pushed the door open, and stepped inside to a home that finally felt like mine. They had tried to erase me, but they had only succeeded in stripping away the veneer, leaving behind the one thing they never expected to find, a woman who knew exactly who she was. The greatest betrayal of my life had been the catalyst for my liberation, and as I sat down at my easel, I realized that freedom isn't the absence of trouble. It's the courage to build something new from the ashes of what you've lost.